Oh, perfect. Good timing. Order. We're now in public session. Welcome, gentlemen. If I may say, for the benefit of the public who may be reading our events here, we will be in public session to begin with colleagues from the Home Office, and then we'll have a certain number of questions for them. And then at a later point, we will go into private session, where we will ask the members of the public to leave as we deal with those issues. So thank you very much, gentlemen. We know who you are, but for the record, if you would state who you are and what you do.
Thank you. Charles Farr, Director General, Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism in the Home Office.
Thank you.
Richard Alcock, Programme Director, CCD Programme.
Peter Hill, Head of Pursuit Policy and Strategy Unit in OSCT in the Home Office.
Excellent, thank you. Colleagues will commence with a number of questions. Don't feel that you all need to answer them if you don't wish to, but also feel free to pile in on any other points if you feel colleagues haven't covered it adequately. Mr. Ellis.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Could I start by asking you about consultation with the CSPs, the ISPs, and the social networks in particular? Because this committee has heard from witnesses from the UK CSPs who have told us that they had indeed had regular high-level contacts with the Home Office in particular, but that they had not been given specific information about precisely what obligations would be imposed on them to enable them to form a view on the extent to which the bill would affect them. So do you have any comment about this?
Well, perhaps I can lead off. Thank you. I think, as you know, we've been meeting regularly with UK CSPs on communications data over the past few years, actually, and certainly in the run-up to the bill. And I think and believe that we shared our broad thinking about what we had in mind before the bill was published, and that we have followed that up with more detailed sessions since the bill appeared. And, of course, we're also speaking to the various trade industry bodies, ISPA, links and so on, where those CSPs are represented. I accept that we have more to do on the finer detail, what you might think of as the content of the notices that would ultimately, if this legislation is approved, be served on the CSPs, although from existing conversations with CSPs, I do think they, in the UK, have a pretty clear idea of that. But I certainly fully accept that those discussions need to continue, and they need to get into more detail the closer we get to the time when the bill is enacted, should it be so. On the ACSPs, particularly the overseas third-party providers, obviously we read the evidence session, the two evidence sessions that you had with them closely several times with a lot of interest. I asked Richard to compile a list of all the meetings we had had with those organisations over the past couple of years. There's a total of 30 meetings.
30?
30, over a 2-year period with overseas providers. Not all of those, it's true, because they go back 2 years, were on the minutiae of the bill. Most of them, all of them were on communications data, let me be clear about that.
And on the general principles?
On the general principles, on the relationship we have with them on communications data, and in all cases, at some point, on the proposed thrust, direction, content of the legislation.
They would have gone back to the IMP provisions of the previous government, wouldn't they?
Well, they would have, of course, read all the previous consultation documents issued by the other government, the last government as well, so yes. And, our relationship with them goes back to that date, so these discussions are not new, you're right. As I've said on the UK companies, fully accept that we need another level of detail, of course. I think it was hard to get to that level of detail before the legislation, frankly. I think Parliament and others had a right to see the legislation before we discussed it in detail with overseas providers. But 30 meetings, I emphasise, over a 2-year period.
So as far as the UK CSPs are concerned, just to confirm your position, they did accept that they've had regular high-level contacts with the Home Office. Yeah. And you've confirmed to my colleague, Lord Armstrong, that it goes back quite a way. And clearly, this bill this draft bill has been in the pipeline in one way, form or another for quite some time.
That's true.
But you're satisfied that as far as the information that was imparted to them and between the parties on the discussions, that they knew about these issues and they were working with the Home Office, and they have been.
Yes, and I think that's reflected in the evidence that they gave to you orally, actually, where the UK CSPs, as I recall from my reading of it, were fairly clear that the consultation process with the Home Office from their perspective was reasonably good. I repeat that there was always scope for us to get into another level of detail.
Yes, and the non-UK CSPs. So if it suggested that there was no consultation prior to the publication of the draft bill, you're confirming that there have been 30 meetings, so you don't accept there was no consultation?
There have been 30 meetings with the overseas providers, notably those from whom you heard evidence over a 2-year period on communications data, including some sessions amongst those on legislation. The degree to which we consulted on the detail of the legislation, of course, varies. And it's true that with some of those companies, one in particular, perhaps I could name that in the later session if you're happy, for a variety of reasons we had less consultation than with some of the others, and I can explain why that is if you allow us to do so after the break.
So I should say, if we do stray inadvertently in areas which are for the private session, please say so. We will respect that.
Thank you.
We certainly don't want to cause any embarrassment to the companies concerned, but it's helpful that you're confirming the position. So this draft bill would impose some obligations on various companies, and we don't need to be specific about company names, but it would potentially involve them in some restructuring of their systems. Would you accept that?
Yes.
And therefore there will be some expenditure required,
Yes.
and where government expects expenditure to be required by third parties, it usually makes good those costs. So there will be an allowance for recoupment from the public purse. Is that your understanding of the position?
Yes, as you know, under the existing provisions, we cover the costs incurred by CSPs in meeting the obligations set out in the legislation. And we have said, and told the CSPs again actually last week, another meeting, that we would continue that commitment through and beyond this legislation.
So as far...
100%.
Yes. I mean, obviously, I think we were challenged in an earlier session to ensure that we were getting value for money and the costs were reasonable. But with that significant proviso, yes.
But the wording of the bill does not say 100%.
That's true.
But it leaves it entirely to the Home Secretary to decide how much.
That's true, and the CSPs have pointed that out to us, and it's a reasonable point. The intention is to cover their costs.
Which is it's difficult to quantify precisely.
Well, it can be in some areas, but we want to be open, and as you know, we've said right along that the principle of this bill is to have cooperation consultation, and that must include a sensible discussion about costs where they're not immediately apparent.
And you're satisfied that the consultation, the cooperation between the Home Office has gone on for quite some time and to a sufficient extent?
Certainly with the UK CSPs, with whom our relationship has inevitably been closer over the years than their overseas counterparts. We've tried to catch up with the overseas networks, who are very important to us, and I'm satisfied that we have a really good cooperative relationship with most of them. I emphasise that there is more level of detail, additional level of detail that is needed in discussions going forward.
Thank you.
Could I ask you, if you've had all this dialogue with them, why is it that they all almost universally, to a man, said they hadn't a clue what the purpose of the bill was and they didn't understand what you were seeking to do in Clause 1? And the overseas one said they hadn't had any dialogue with you in any case. But if you had all this dialogue, why are they in the dark about what you want to achieve?
Well, I wonder whether that's a question in some respects that you may have to, if I may say, ask of them. We have had a consultation in which we have set out the purpose of the legislation, the main components of it, and we've got into as much detail as we could at the time when the consultations took place. And those discussions were in the context of a wider engagement on communications data. Sometimes I think that the people with whom we have been having consultations were not the people who gave evidence to you, but I can't speak for easily the CSPs and why they said and made the comments that they did.
Do you think it boils down to commercial embarrassment?
I think it's certainly true, and we can discuss it more in the later session if it's helpful, that companies will want to and be understandably wary, as would we, about disclosing the extent of cooperation that they may have with us at the moment and may foresee in the future.
Perfectly understandable. That's why we had a private session with them. And in a private session, again, they were all fairly unanimous that those who had dialogue with you did not understand what you were seeking to achieve and could not understand the nature of the perceived gap. And I'm just wondering, did you fail to communicate adequately? Did they fail to understand? But I think you can see where we're coming from when some of us would say we are concerned at the level of the consultation up till now.
Well, I'm afraid, find myself repeating. I mean, we've had 30 meetings with them. All of those have included sessions on the legislation. I've got records of those meetings. It seems to me, rereading those records in the light of the evidence, that we gave as good an idea as we could of the thrust of the bill and its general components. I would accept, and you've made this point and others have made it to you, that the language of Clause 1 is obviously very general. I think that's a drafting problem rather than, as it were, a problem of our intent, and it's one of the things we must take away and look at, and we are already looking at it and talking to our ministers about it. So I understand how a reading of Clause 1 may not give the precision that the UK or indeed other CSPs might want, and we're aware of that and need to deal with it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hubbard.
Thank you, Lord Chair. It's good to have you back in front of this committee. If I could just start by following on from these consultation questions. I mean, we've also heard from people like the Information Commissioner, we're still waiting to hear from the Director of Public Prosecutions, from the Interception Commissioner, that they didn't get much consultation in advance of the bill. Do you think that's accurate, or do you think they're in some way not giving the committee the full story either?
I mean, I can explain, if it's helpful to you, the consultation we had with the Information Commissioner. The Information Commissioner had seen the draft clauses of the bill in advance, which affected him. He had had a meeting with the Minister. He had had 3 hours with Richard going through the detail of the legislation. I felt and had hoped that a combination of all those steps would have conveyed what we were trying to do. If we failed to do that, as I have to infer we did, then we must go back and do it again. It was not for want of trying, and we did have those sessions.
It just strikes me how many people there are where your version is so different from theirs. When you came before us before...
Well, I'm sorry, if I may, we have the records of these meetings.
I'm sure we'd be delighted to see them if you want to send them to us. When you came before, you said, question 79, that major CSPs understand the problem we're trying to solve, understand the technology,
yes,
which we're proposing to solve it, agree that that technology is feasible, looking for legislation to underpin collaboration in the future. Do you still think that's the case?
Yes, rereading the evidence from the UK CSPs, and as I've done, I think that accurately summarises the thrust of what they were saying to you and have been saying to us.
But it's not just the UK CSPs. I mean, you'll know question 569, I put that to Yahoo, Microsoft, Google, who all explicitly said no. They didn't recognise that. Charles Farr's characterisation of the conversation is not one that I recognise.
But I was referring to CSPs, and I think in the language we use, we tend to refer to the over-the-top providers as ACSPs. So certainly my intent in answering that question was to address the UK response.
Okay. You mentioned Clause 1 and the powers there. We asked some time ago to see a draft of the order power within Clause 1. You said that there are details of notices still to be worked up, which presumably means you've actually looked at the order that would give you power to have those notices. Can you share that with the committee?
The order?
Yeah.
Well, that's a matter for ministers, and they would have to obviously decide on that.
I mean, have you spoken to any of the providers about what the order or notices might look like?
Yes, perhaps I could turn to Richard on that because he's been having more of those discussions.
Well, we've had discussions in terms of the additional data types that we may wish for those service providers to retain, noting that it's going to take a bit of time should the legislation go forward for things to be implemented, and technologies and services can change in that time period. But where we are now, there is certain information which is not stored routinely by UK CSP. Some cases weblogs, some cases IP data. I discussed earlier about the NatPat problem. And it's really fundamentally those two issues in the majority of cases. But there are a broad range of other aspects. It's very much service dependent in relation to the different service providers in the United Kingdom and overseas in terms of the data that we would want them to retain over time as their businesses and services change.
Sorry, I understand that part of my question about parliamentary scrutiny. Mr. Farr said earlier the Parliament should see the information before the providers. And yet you're saying you've got a draft order, there is draft notices, you've been talking to people about it, but this committee, which is supposed to be looking at it, can't see it.
I didn't say we have the draft order. I didn't say we have the draft notices. I think what Richard was saying is we're discussing with the providers the data types where we think we might ask them for additional assistance.
Okay.
Primarily, of course, in the form of retention rather than generation.
And if I then move to clause 1, as written, I think you said it was a drafting problem. I mean, you've now been working on this bill for 4 years. This was intended to be part of the Crime and Courts bill.
Well, we've been working on it for 2 years.
But I thought you were saying that it was related to the consultations from the previous government.
Indeed it is, but
maybe 3 years
this
ago.
bill is a different bill, and we weren't working on it 4 years ago.
So, but something which was ready to be part of the Crime and Courts bill has a drafting problem in clause 1. You're now saying you might look at that again. I mean, would you look at something that's specifically fixed, for example, the NatPat problem Mr. Alcock just mentioned? Would that solve part of your problems?
Well, I've heard that being proposed. As Richard has said, one of the data types one of the areas where we're struggling certainly is on IP resolution. It's not the only area. The weblog issue is also important, and the issue about being too specific in the legislation, or a risk, and government may of course choose to take it, but a risk is that you may well have to come back with additional legislation at some point in the near future as data types change and other gaps emerge. And I think part of our intention with the drafting as it is at the moment was to future-proof the legislation to a degree that avoided reverting to Parliament in short order. I think on the drafting itself, quite a lot of questions that have been addressed to the committee I think have expressed uncertainty about what types of data we are going to be after. And although we thought the bill was clear, it clearly could be clearer. We are only seeking those data types which enable us to address the so-called who, when and where of a communication. No other data types are in the scope of this bill, and nor would we want to change the definition, particularly of what constitutes who, when and where, although you've raised a question of subscriber information, which is also an important one. So we didn't quite see that the bill clause 1 was as general and open-ended as others have observed it is. But as I say, we want to go back and look at it again, and we must advise ministers on whether it can be changed, enhanced or improved.
How big a part in your thinking in drafting clause 1 as wide as it is this belief, and it's a genuine belief, that you won't get a bill like this every couple of years? It's been 12 years since REPA. I know from my own experience one can get a criminal justice bill every year in the Home Office, but you can't get bills like this. No. Hypothetically, if you had a guarantee from the usual channels that every 3 years you could amend REPA, would you draft it more narrowly?
I've never known a guarantee of that kind.
I accept that.
If the committee can conjure up a guarantee of that kind, I think we'll pocket it and take it away.
I appreciate you can't answer. It's a hypothetical question. But it does seem to be a large part of your thinking that you have to future-proof this bill for whatever technology will be invented in 5 years' time. Therefore, the bill is so wide, trying to capture...
Well, not 5 years, that's the problem.
2 years. 3 years.
Indeed. So, I think you might resolve the IP issue, which I believe has been demonstrated to you, but another issue may well come along very quickly after.
Thank you very much. Lord Strasburger.
Mr. Farr, we've heard a lot from you and others about the 25% data gap.
Do you accept that with the exponential growth in methods and volume of communication, the communications data now available to law enforcement agencies is in fact vastly greater than it was in 2000? It is simply not 100% of what might now be available. For example, 12 years ago, none of us were carrying around with us what are in fact personal trackers, which other people call smartphones. So there's been an exponential growth in the availability of data.
Well, I don't entirely agree with your point, no. You're, of course, absolutely right. There is far more communications, and there is far more data attached to communications, and there's far more data generally crossing the internet, not all of which is about communications. All those three things are definitely true. The key point is that the data which is there does not enable us to address the questions which law enforcement and the agencies have to address. In other words, there's more data, but it's not always relevant or useful to us. And that, in a sense, is why we're here.
Well, we've heard from a lot of witnesses, and we've been on visits, and it's been very clear to us that the vast majority of the data that law enforcement, we haven't been to the agencies, I have to say, but law enforcement and others want, is about the fact of the communication, the who and when and where, and the location, which is the bonus that the law enforcement agencies have gained over the last 10 or 12 years.
Well, that is only what we want.
And very few of the law enforcement agencies, in fact hardly any of the law enforcement agencies that we've seen, have come to us saying we need more. They've all come to us saying we want to preserve the status quo. They've come worried that they're going to lose what they've got, which is, I think, not the intention of this bill.
Well, I'm afraid I don't recognise that characterisation of what law enforcement is saying, at least not saying to us, and indeed it doesn't reflect our own calculations. You know, perhaps I can just talk a bit about the methodology of the 25%, if you're interested. You know, this is not a figure we've plucked out of thin air. We arrived at this figure through two routes. What I would call loosely a bottom-up route and a top-down route. The bottom-up route, the detail of which we've given to the Intelligence Security Committee, examines provider by provider working in this country, whether based in this country or based overseas, and the degree to which they are able to retain and provide the categories of data we need to answer those three questions. And we've produced that on the basis of input from the law enforcement agencies. That's the first way in which we begin to try to scope the so-called gap and develop the figure of 25%. Now, we've also approached the problem in a different way by looking at communications trends in general out over the next 10 years. What's happening to the communications industry? What type of communications are they going to be? Which of those types of communications are we know going to be relevant to us? And what the current retention is for each of them. And we've done the calculations around that process to check whether the figure we get from the bottom-up process is reflected in the figure we get, for want of a better word, from the top-down process. And we come up with a figure of around 25%, with the direction of travel that we've set out in our evidence. So the police have had an input into all that work, and as far as I know, are completely content with it. And I'd be very surprised if they, or in their evidence to you, they were to say we don't find a gap now, and actually everything currently is all right.
Well, the fact is that we've gone in search of this missing data with 25%, with every witness that we've had, both CSPs and public authorities, and almost without exception, there have been one or two, the evidence has been that they could not identify where there is a shortfall.
Well,
We seem to have
My
another...
reading of the evidence given to you by the UK CSPs was that to a person they all accepted there was a gap, without exception. And my understanding of your visit to various other authorities was that they had demonstrated a gap. We have given very detailed information to the ISC, company by company, data type by data type, giving percentiles of delivery against 100 that we're getting at the moment. And we've set out for you in the restricted Annex B of our evidence more about the methodology by which we're trying to demonstrate that. You know, I recognise, and we would be the first to admit, these are difficult calculations to make. But I really believe that we have demonstrated the existence of a gap which is currently impeding law enforcement efforts, and that we have been able to demonstrate how that gap will change with or without legislation.
I think we've been able to see that there is a gap. We couldn't identify where the 25% came from. We couldn't identify how it was going to go up to 35% and then down to 15%.
Well, I mean, if there's any further detail we can give to elaborate on Annex B and the written evidence, we're obviously very happy to do that. And we have given very detailed company-by-company information to the ISC to complement that, and we can follow that up as well. I'm concerned, obviously, that we're not making the case to you with the evidence that you're looking at. I can only reiterate that we're happy to provide further material if it would help in particular areas.
In the oral evidence, the head of the EU policy for Microsoft, speaking for Hotmail, told us that you were unable to articulate what the 25% was because you could not articulate what the 100% would look like. Can you comment on this?
Well, to be honest, I was baffled by the comments. I mean, I thought our written evidence, which perhaps hadn't reached Microsoft, was quite clear. The 100% to which we refer is 100% of the data required to tell us the who, when and where of a communications that is of interest to the police or the agencies. I said that the 100% is not attainable any longer, and it's not the purpose of this, or the aspiration of this legislation, to get us back to that point, because we won't. It was relevant to us only in the era of fixed lines, when we all just had a BT fixed line telephone. The 25%, therefore, is a reference to the data gap. 25% of the data is missing that we would require to identify the who, when and where of a communications. Now, I think, really, I hope certainly that's clear in our written evidence, and I was puzzled by the fact that you didn't understand it.
Thank you.
If you were able to obtain the IP and weblog information, if you were able to get that, how much of the gap would you then close?
Could we do that in the next session?
Oh, by all means, happy to do so. Also on the who, when and where, you've said that's the only thing you're interested in, the only thing that matters. Mm-hmm. Now, some of our witnesses are concerned that subscriber data is an old-fashioned definition in the year 2000. Subscriber data can now catch hundreds of things, which allows people to say this is a wide-ranging snooper's charter.
Yes.
If the bill could be redefined, or part of Clause 1 redefined, that one was only asking for who, when and where, and put tighter definitions into what is subscriber data, would that give you all of what you want, or most of what you want?
So
or a lot of what you want?
We recognise the concern that you've identified and expressed about the degree to which the term subscriber data could expand to suit the data that was available in a social media provider. Buried in an annex to our evidence, for which I apologise, Annex F, is an explanation of the data types that we think we mean when we refer to something like subscribers. And if I may, I'll read it out. Subscriber data includes name, date of birth, billing address, delivery address, contact information, account reference. It doesn't include some of the things that the social media networks might not have as a subscriber. We do not want that material. It would be disproportionate to try to obtain that material, and we are happy to go back into the legislation and see if we can circumscribe that mere. It's certainly not our purpose.
I think that's very helpful, if I can say so. I think that's helpful. Mr. Mosley, sorry.
Early on in our discussions on the draft bill, we were told a figure about 1.8 billion for the total cost.
Yeah.
Is that the figure that you're still working to?
Yes. The business case, of course, is being refreshed. I think we've mentioned that to you before. And I fear may only be finalised after the committee has finished its deliberations, but we do not anticipate that it will come up with a figure higher than 1.8 billion. And the 1.8 billion, of course, builds in quite a lot of optimism bias anyway, which we discussed last week.
Okay. I know when we spoke to the CSPs and the other communication service providers, we did ask them if you had spoken to them about costs, and if they had any estimate of what their costs would be. I'm sure you've read the evidence that pretty much all of them said either there'd been no discussions or very minimal discussions on the cost, and that they themselves would find it very difficult to estimate what the cost would be. How have you made the estimates of the CSP costs?
As you know, we talk to the CSPs on a very regular basis about their existing data costs, everything that is incurred on our behalf in implementing existing repo arrangements. And we know to quite a high level detail how those costs are comprised, what the basis for them is, and we, as I say, discuss them on a regular or regularly. Those discussions and the data we have already have formed the basis of our calculations about the costs that the CSPs may incur in future. We've added in considerable optimism bias on top of that. So I wouldn't want you to conclude that we have plucked these figures out of thin air. They're based on existing costs which we have established with the providers already. And it's our view, and we've read the evidence and reconsidered this since then, but it's still our view that these figures accurately represent the likely cost going out to 2020. I think some of the reason, one of the reasons why the CSPs are uncertain about cost is because, at least in their conversations with us, they are very uncertain about any obligation we might place on them regard to third-party data. And I had a meeting last week, and I think they were under the misapprehension that we might go to them to collect third-party data even before asking the third-party data to cooperate with us ourselves. And they were understandably concerned if that were to be the case. And were it to be the case, of course, the costs would be rather different from what they otherwise might be. We, I hope, have reassured them, and I would repeat, if I may, that it would be in extremis for us to go to them and ask for the collection of third-party data, and we don't expect to in the vast majority of cases, and we have calculated costs accordingly.
I think one figure that shook us as a committee was when the guy from Twitter said that it took 3 years, 2 months to go from 1 tweet to 1 billion tweets, and now they take 1 billion tweets every 2.5 days. What sort of growth in network traffic are you working into your figures?
Richard, do you want to-
We are assuming a growth in network traffic of around a factor of 10 over a 10-year period, but I should stress that in the case of certain communications types and the number of tweets, for example, within a tweeting session, there may only be a need to understand the comms data related to one tweet within a particular session. So whilst the growth might be exponential, that curve may come down quite significantly by virtue of the fact the value of the who, where and when can be attributed to just one tweet within a tweeting session, if that makes sense.
Did you say there was a factor of 10 over 10 years? Or a factor of 10 every year? For
10 over
10
10
over
years.
10 years.
So, Mr. Howard, did you have a point on that?
But I must
Sorry,
stress,
sorry.
I was going to go on a bit.
Mr. Alcock, do you have anything else to add to that? No?
I must put this in context. This is all about the amount of information that's of value to law enforcement. Okay, I'm not projecting.
It's not all about volume.
It's not about net volume over a 10-year period.
They have to store the whole volume, so you can find the little bits you want.
No, they only have to store the information that we require of them that is of investigative value.
Okay, right, thank you. How was it?
Can you come back to me if it's on this
If I understood correctly, you just said that the costs for the current scheme were based on the idea that most of the problems would be solved by collaboration with overseas providers, essentially. And that's
right.
Presumably that means that if those collaborative discussions, and I'm still not quite clear how the bill is required to have the collaborative discussions, if those discussions are not successful, the costs would necessarily then go up quite significantly. Is that what you were just saying?
Well, that depends how we responded to the lack of success of the collaborative discussion, doesn't it? I mean, the costs would go up if you had very uncollaborative relationships with providers overseas, which is not the case. And having had those or developed those very uncollaborative relationships, you decided, or ministers decided, that they would revert to a request for a UK CSP to collect third-party data off their network. Now, there's quite a lot of ifs and buts in there, and I certainly don't think it's inevitable that the cost would go up if we didn't get all that we wanted from a overseas service provider.
Mr. Mosley?
One of the things that the CSP said was that, and it's what you've concentrated now on, is the cost of storage of the data.
Yeah.
They were saying that they've got an awful lot of other costs, such as engineering, secure storage, safe destructions, all these other costs that they couldn't quantify, and they didn't believe that you would be able to quantify. Have you included those costs in your estimates?
We have all of those.
And if so, how have you reached those estimates?
On the basis of the existing financial discussions we have with data providers, and on the basis of consultation with other people involved in whichever part of the engineering process we might be discussing.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Mosley. Okay, Lord Armstrong. Sorry, Lord Armstrong.
One of the people we took evidence from was the Information Commissioner, who was, I think, very demure, not to say non-committal, about the need for the bill. They said that was somebody else's business, not his. I was reminded of the Light Brigade. His not to reason why, it is but to do and die, or die. But he was much more exercised about the cost, the extra resources he would need to do what the bill asks him to do in clause 22.5. Have you consulted with him on what extra resources he might need, and are they factored into your cost estimate?
Yes, we have consulted with him. We believe that the sum is about £150,000, and we think that's affordable as part of 1.8 billion.
Thank you.
That's the sum.
It's in the cost estimates you give us. Thank you very much.
Lord Foulkes, on this point?
Yeah, on this particular point, the way it's framed in the bill is to keep under review. He's got to keep quite a lot under review. That was what his concern was, I think.
Yes. Sorry.
And he wasn't quite sure exactly what he had to keep under review at the moment.
Okay, Peter.
Yeah, the Information Commissioner has responsibilities as set out in the data retention regulations. We don't think substantively the responsibilities in the Communications Data Bill are very different. There may be more providers or there may be more data, and he may, as is entirely his prerogative, want to perform those responsibilities differently. But if one looks at the regulations which make him responsible for monitoring the application of the provisions of the regulations, which relate to the security of data and relate to the destruction of data, and you then look at clause 22.5, which relate to the security and integrity of data and the destruction of data after 12 months, those are in essence the responsibilities that he has under existing legislation, whether it's the Data Protection Act, the Data Retention Regulations, or So I think in terms of responsibilities, to us they are substantively similar. If there are going to be more companies retaining data or more data retained, then I understand he feels that he may need more resource to deal with that. But in terms of how he performs the role, it's obviously a matter for him, but there's no reason to believe that that is in essence a different role from the role that he currently has.
So it may be different.
It's £15,000 a year.
No, his estimate,
150.
his estimate, I think, is that it would be £150,000 a year.
A year.
Yeah.
But we obviously haven't had the chance to go through the business case for that in detail with him.
Lord Faulks or Lord Armstrong, any follow-up?
No, that's fine.
Also on the costings, you've estimated the cost will be 1.8 billion, but the benefits are estimated at about 6 billion. Now, amongst those benefits, it would seem that the safeguarding of lives and saving human life can range from 2 billion to 3.3 billion, if we read your figures correctly. And this is on the basis that in 25 to 40% of instances where there's a threat to life situation, when making an application for data, a life might be saved. Now, that's between 1,100 lives and 1,800 people over the next 10 years. Forgive me, but I find all those figures rather fanciful. Now, how do you come to those calculations, and why the wide divergence between 2 billion and 3.5 billion?
So we are dependent for these figures from the law enforcement agencies whose job it is to deal with a threat to life situation. And therefore, these figures draw on their data. And we are advised, from consultation with a range of police forces, that in what is described as a threat to life situation, the number of occasions when a life is actually at risk and is saved does vary. And it varies from force to force and from type of emergency service to type of emergency service. So we can get one set of figures from the Met with the resources at their disposal and the geographical area that they have to command, and we will get a different type of figure from a rural police force dealing with a slightly different type of situation over much different and wider geographical areas. And when I put your question to them, that's their explanation back to me. It depends on the type of force that's engaged in the threat to life operation. So we are repeating to you the bandwidth, the variation that we have been given back to us, which is 25 to 40.
That's helpful. We may be able to take it up with the police next week. Because these are largely police figures rather than security service.
Absolutely, yes.
But the average about £1.7 million per person.
Yeah.
Now, I can accept each of us, if we lose a loved one, 1.7 million is not much. We may value their lives more than that. But it does seem to be rather high. If the police are saying in a threat to life situation, a life is saved, it saved them, the police, 1.7 million?
No, I don't think we were making that point, and if it looks as though we were, with taking down the wrong path. Again, I think the answer to this is in the annex to our written evidence under benefits, where colleagues may recollect better than me, the figure we took for a value on a life reflected a Treasury figure which is used in a number of different scenarios across government. So it's that's right. And we are given that, and we don't really debate it.
Okay, maybe we should.
I'm sorry.
Who would bear that cost if that life is not saved?
Well, I'd have to go in and look at the Treasury methodology. We can come back to you on it. It's a conventional figure.
Can I press that another way? And it's something we may need to challenge other areas of government. The cost of 1.8 billion to implement it is paid by the Treasury, the taxpayer.
Yeah.
If there's a saving of people who don't die, the Treasury doesn't get that benefit. That's a saving to my family and to other families who haven't lost a loved one. So how does the government get the income from someone living when they've got about a cost of 1.8 billion to implement the bill? Am I making myself clear?
Yes, but you're going to Lord Strasburger's question, I think, again, and I have to unless colleagues can help, revert to colleagues in government to try to get the answer you want.
I think, if I may, Charles, there's an explanation within the report, the Home Office report dated 2003-2004, which I referred to before in our last evidence session, I believe, which goes through the methodology and what factors are taken into account and where the savings are accrued. We've tried to summarise that on page 77 on our written evidence, and in fact the reference to the report is there.
We could, if it's helpful, Lord Chairman, send you a copy of that Home Office report.
Just for clarification, these figures relate. Can you confirm these figures relate to the benefit to be derived from increasing the availability of data from your estimate of 75% to your estimate of 85%, i.e., these are the benefits that would be derived if this bill were enacted? Or is it a wider figure? Is this the incremental benefit from implementing this bill, which the 1.8 billion cost is certainly intended to be?
10% improvement in closing the gap.
Yes, again, the answer to this is in annex of our written evidence, but Richard, do you want to do it?
Yeah, fundamentally, the proportion we're talking about here in terms of the lives saved, that benefit, that proportion of the benefit is accrued by virtue of implementing the bill and achieving the objectives over a 10-year period. So we can save that bound of lives over that 10-year period by virtue of implementing the bill.
So there's no inclusion of the benefits that are derived from RIPA at the moment?
It's the net benefit.
It's the increase.
It's the delta by having the bill.
Thank you.
Excellent. Mr. Hubbard.
Following on from that question, I mean, your annex figure goes up to about 2,000 lives in round figures. Now, if you're saving 2,000 lives over 10 years with a 10% increase, then roughly doing a calculation, that suggests you're saving 1,500 a year with the 75% data that you currently have. Now, if that's the case, I would hope that you'd be able to substantiate something like 1,500, it won't be exact numbers, of course, something like 1,500 lives a year that are saved using communications data currently. Do you have figures to support that?
We've got this information from law enforcement. They've estimated to us, given figures to us in terms of the number of lives saved that could be saved by virtue of the bill over a 10-year period. I don't have the figures to hand in terms of how many lives are saved right now, but in terms of the proportion of in threat to life cases whereby there is that benefit. They've given us those estimates and have been, we've had them validated.
But I mean, estimating is always tricky. We have the great advantage in this case that we can look backwards on what we've done with communications data. We've heard from everybody how well used communications data currently is. The Met were very keen to defend that, actually, rather than pushing for more. So can you find out figures about the number of lives saved currently using CD? Because if your argument is consistent, one would expect something like 1,500. I don't expect it to be precise, of course. There should be something well over 1,000 lives currently being saved using communications data. Well, if that's not the case, then it's hard to believe we'll get something more. We've got to think about this, if I may, in terms of over a 10-year period. We're talking about 2,000 lives over a 10-year period. But what I'm saying is that if a 10% increase in data availability saves 2,000 lives over a 10-year period, then over the last 10-year period, there should be something like 15,000 lives saved, based on the 75% that there already has been. I don't mind whether you do it annually or over 10 years, but if you can find the 1,500 a year or 15,000 over 10 years, then that would give this committee much more confidence that you can project 2,000 in the next 10 years.
Well, we're not talking about 1,500. We're talking here in terms of a net benefit of 2,000 lives over a 10-year period by virtue of the arrangement we put in place. So, on average, obviously, that's a 200 a year.
But I realise what you're saying, but do you understand that what I'm trying to say, which is that we have been using communications data. As we sit here, there is communications data being used, presumably used in exactly the ways to save lives. If the estimate of 2,000 over 10 years is about right, then we should be able to make an estimate. I understand
the question. I think one of the issues that's come out of your scrutiny and indeed our work for it has been, that we need much better data about comms data. Yeah. And I completely accept that, and we are talking to the police so that going forward, any future committee or Parliament will be able to, or we will be able to address some of the questions that you have asked. For example, to how many people do these comms data requests refer? Which is a really key question which we must be able to answer. I think the question you're raising now is another one. I entirely accept that we should be able to answer it if the business case is credible. I think we have to go away and see what they have, but we must make sure that we organise ourselves so that we can answer that question routinely in the future.
Putting those numbers to one side, it's a public figure. It's in the Inception of Communications Commissioner report. Between 30 and 35,000 urgent oral requests a year.
Yeah.
The vast majority of those are threat to life situations, and a significant number of them will result in vulnerable individuals being saved.
Yeah.
So I don't think the figures here, whatever the underpinning methodology, are inherently implausible when you see just how many authorisations are going on for threat to life on a daily basis.
But I think those figures, all I'm challenging is how does the government, the taxpayer, the Treasury, the society benefit by 1.7 million if a child is saved? I can understand how the family would benefit hundreds of millions if the child...
Well, as I say, we deal with a standard Treasury methodology. It's set out in the Henry's document. We will send it to you. And I do want to emphasise, I understand this point. I think it's really important. As part of our work on better collection of data in the future, we will factor that in.
Before I move into Lord Jones, who's desperate to get in just now, if we are to question this further, was it from ACPO generally, or each police force you trolled the figures from? So we were
not ACPO generally.
No, it was from each force. Okay, excellent. Yes. Thank you very much. Lord Jones.
Nobody said Mr. Gordon Brown would be to blame for the figures we've just had. I just wish Simon Jenkins, a well-known contrarian, could be a witness here and comment on the minutes I've just heard. However, this is simple. And, Lord Chairman, the question is, you have said in your written evidence that costs and benefits will be subject to change and are being reviewed as part of the revised business case. Questions are, has that review already begun? Are there yet any indications of what the outcome might be? Will the review take account of the cost to service providers?
So the answer to the three questions is yes, the review has already been done, and Richard will have the detail, but the business case, subject to the approvals process, should be with us very early in the new year. Are the indications of the outcome, what the outcome might be? May I leave that to Richard? Will the review take account of cost to service providers? Yes. So the middle question. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of indication, I say it's the review is at an early stage. I think it's unlikely, very unlikely, that the figure will exceed 1.8 billion.
Thank you very much. Concise question, concise answers. Mr. Havert.
Thank you. I was going to ask about subscriber data in general, but I think you've already addressed this, and I think there is an understanding that it needs to be well defined rather than open definition. But related to that is also the definitions of use and traffic data, which I hope you'd accept also need very tight definition on the face of the bill. There's also the issue about the relationship to content. The definition on page 63 of the bill is fascinating in that use data specifically excludes content, but traffic data and subscriber data don't explicitly exclude content. Is this just a drafting error and it should be absolutely clear that anything which is content should be excluded?
Yes.
And how clear are you that there is a crystal clear definition of what is content and what isn't content?
Well, the committee and you are well aware of the debate on this. We continue to believe that there is a sufficiently clear definition of data and content to make this bill legally viable.
And would you envisage achieving that by, for example, having a list of which fields are actually counted as what? Would that resolve the problem? Because otherwise you'll have the same broadness problem whenever there is a grey area.
Well, you will have ideas on this, and I think we'd be really interested to read them and take them away. I mean, I just emphasise, as we have done before, it is not the intention of this bill to engage in some sort of scope creep. We are after simply those data types which enable us to answer those three key questions: who, when, and where. And we want to ensure that we don't get into subscriber data which is of a rather recent kind, social media subscriber data. There will be other areas where we must ring fence to stop encroachment as well. Any ideas you have, we would be very interested. We're looking at this certainly now.
So you would not be opposed to a revised bill which said Schedule 1, subscriber data is XYZ, content is ABC, provided it was reasonably future-proof, or gave you what I think you call information of investigative value.
Peter?
So at the moment there is a hierarchy which gets you to what you mean by each of these in day-to-day detail. So at the top level you have the legislation, at the second level you have the order, at the third level you have the notice, and at the fourth level, which you've probably all read, the code of practice, the statutory code of practice, which sets out in rather laborious detail what is meant by subscriber information, what is meant by traffic information, what is meant by service use information. It doesn't set out what content is, because content is everything which isn't the categories that you've just defined. Now, whether one can introduce some of the things that are in other bits of the package into the primary legislation, I think is something we'll have to look at.
Do you think it might reassure those who call this bill a snooper's charter, who say clause 1 is really wide open? We know what the Home Office says in private, we're only after these little tiddly bits, but clause 1 allows the whole world to be captured. Do you think that might reassure the public if you were able to define the bill more closely, subscriber and content and so on?
As I understand the evidence given to the committee, the primary concern about the scope and the definitions related to the ability, which appears to be in this legislation, for us to require the generation of all forms of subscriber information which a normal person might consider to be content, or things that they never envisaged they would be providing to a company in order for them to provide a service to them. So I think it's probably fair that the combination of the generation provisions in clause 1 with the general definition of subscriber data on page 63, whatever clause it's in, without taking into account the underpinning code of practice and order and notice.
And orders which are secret, which also unnerve.
Well, notices which are secret, not orders, yes. But the code of practice is publicly available and contains a considerable amount of detail about what we mean. But I do accept that the combination of that generation and the definition of subscriber data can lead to the concern that while the notice may be very specific, as Charles has set out, the possibility nevertheless exists that if a future government wanted to go out and require a CSP to generate...
Even the current government.
To generate subscriber data on any number of issues, from colour preference to favourite TV programme, that in theory we could, which is absolutely and clearly not the intention of the bill.
You seem to be indicating, I won't put words in your mouth, we may press this later, but you seem to be indicating that if we could come up with, or if someone could come up with better definitions to give you the information of investigative value and cut out the rest, you might be reasonably content. Yes. Thank you very much. Any other questions for the public session? Thank you very much. In that case, if I could ask the public to withdraw, please. Order. We'll have a recess for a couple of minutes while that happens. If anyone wants to leave, please do so. We can have a couple of minutes. Or, more water, please. More water. Yes.
Committee Room 2A, sound. Committee Room 2A,